This week, Western intelligence released new estimates on the casualties from the Ukraine war. According to the estimates, 1 million casualties have occurred since the Russian invasion in February 2022. According to estimates, Russia has suffered 200,000 deaths and 400,000 injuries, while Ukraine has suffered 80,000 deaths and 400,000 injuries. Both Russia and Ukraine have refrained from commenting, but it's probable that they won't reach a consensus, given that they both employ exaggerated enemy casualties and underestimated their own to gain an advantage in the information battle. As discussions over peace talks continue, the grim figures are making headlines, with both hawks and doves attempting to press their positions ahead of the United Nations General Assembly meeting next week, where Ukraine President Zelensky is expected to unveil his Ukrainian Victory Plan. President Zelensky created the Ukrainian Victory Plan to replace the 10-point peace plan, but he has not released its details. The goal is to get enough international support at the UN to convince the international community to support Russia to agree to attend face-to-face peace talks with a stated goal of a November start date. President Zelensky has publicly declared that the new plan is 90% complete and requires review with the White House before the General Assembly meeting. President Zelensky gave the first glimpse of the new peace proposal at the 20th annual Yalta European Strategy meeting, speaking from Kyiv. He asserted that we can either militarily or diplomatically drive out an occupying army to liberate ourselves from occupation. These statements, along with the plan's title, indicate the overall tone of the strategy. The title of Ukrainian Victory Plan implies that one person's victory is synonymous with another's loss. This is fine when a simple diplomatic and political gesture to declare victory redefines what victory actually means. However, the declaration of being freed of occupation implies that the plan aims to restore Ukraine's borders to those of 1991. Ukraine maintains the stance that any peace plan must ensure the restoration and protection of its territorial integrity. Several polls have revealed a shift in the Ukrainian population's stance, indicating a willingness to engage in negotiations with Russia to end the war, but a decreased likelihood of endorsing territorial concessions to Russia. While it makes sense for the invaded country to demand territorial restoration, how can diplomacy achieve these goals without making concessions to Russia? The diplomatic options available to Ukraine would include not joining NATO or the European Union or making any associations with these organizations. These two concessions would mean that Ukraine's security and long-term stability will remain vulnerable to Russian intervention in the future. And this has been an issue since the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. The only other realistic concession would be economic concessions to the Russians, such as the natural resources of occupied eastern Ukraine. The issue with this is that it would deny Ukraine a source of revenue and jobs, which would create financial stability for the country. It is true that Ukraine currently does not have access to these resources due to the Russian occupation, so giving the rights up as a concession would be a continuation of the status quo. This is deceiving, because a significant portion of Western aid to Ukraine is not military aid but economic aid to keep the economy going and maintain a stable society. Giving up these rights as a concession to regain lost territory would mean that the West would have to continue providing economic assistance to Ukraine for the foreseeable future, even with peace restored. The alternative involves the West directly compensating Russia to exit Ukraine, a strategy that appears improbable and politically unfeasible due to the anticipated strong opposition from voters. The alternative is that Ukraine has nothing to offer, and the West and Russia will negotiate its concessions. Many analysts view this as the ultimate Russian goal, interpreting the war as a response to Russian grievances against the West since the Soviet Union's fall in December 1991. After the Soviet Union fell, President Boris Yeltsin assumed power as Russian Federation president and negotiated many of the post-Cold War agreements between Russia and the West. However, Russia found itself in a precarious position due to the collapse of the communist system, its lack of strength to challenge the West, and the declining health of Yeltsin. Vladimir Putin, who served as President Yeltsin's close deputy and eventually succeeded him, views the war and its negotiations as a chance to address post-Cold War grievances, including NATO expansion and issues with Western-dominated institutions like the IMF and international global trade. This implies that the West and Russia could debate Ukraine's fate, similar to how France and the United Kingdom negotiated with Germany over Czechoslovakia's fate in the Munich Agreement of 1938. This does not imply that Hitler or Chamberlain represent any country. Rather, other countries negotiate one's fate and then impose a settlement on that country. The other question is, are President Zelensky or President Putin ready for peace? President Putin announced a call-up of an additional 180,000 recruits to increase the size of the army to 1.5 million and the total armed forces to 2.4 million by December 2024. The call-up of 180,000 additional recruits falls significantly short of the general mobilization plans from early in the war, which were so unpopular that many Russian men fled the country to avoid the conflict, ultimately leading to the scrapping of the mobilization plan. The Russian government asserted that the need for the additional forces stems from a broader military reform initiative that transcends the conflict in Ukraine. However, it is contradictory for the Russian government to claim that they require an additional 180,000 soldiers for Ukraine, given their assertion that the war is progressing in their favor. The Ukraine has been pushing the United States and the United Kingdom to end all restrictions on the use and type of weapons donated to Ukraine and allow them to strike targets deeper into Russia. Last week, British Prime Minister Starmer and US President Biden met to discuss the issue, but they deferred the decision, much to the frustration of President Zelensky, who again called for the lifting of all the restrictions. He also asserted that, given the extensive damage to Ukraine's infrastructure and the introduction of North Korean and anticipated Iranian missiles, which allow Russia to attack Ukraine without any restrictions, the US and the UK should consider implementing similar restrictions on their own weapons. Additionally, he urged Ukraine's allies to assume a more proactive role in intercepting missiles and drones over Ukraine, a tactic they have already employed against Israel in response to Iranian proxy attacks. Ukrainian and Polish officials met to discuss the removal of European aid for draft-age men from Ukraine, who choose to avoid military service by living outside of Ukraine and in the European Union, with the aim of compelling more men to serve in the armed forces. The Ukraine peace plan appears to hinge upon a threat to expand the war into Russia, while Russia's relies on a war of attrition to ground down Ukraine and outlast Western support for the war. Both Ukraine and Russia rely on external sources to sustain their wars, with Ukraine relying on the West for financial support and weapons, while Russia, although less dependent, relies on Iran and North Korea for weapons, and China for market access and dual-use products. The US and UK are open to releasing weapons, but they have stated that they do not want to risk expanding the war by crossing another Russian red line. However, they could potentially use this as leverage to convince Russia to attend peace talks. Germany, having confirmed its plan to reduce its support to Ukraine in 2025, has also called for a negotiated end to the war. Eurobond holders have agreed to write off part of Ukraine's owed debt, anticipating a drawdown in the war and refraining from extending further credit until the war's conclusion. China, while advocating for the end of the war, has exercised restraint to avoid appearing to diminish its support for Russia. However, the prospect of sanctions, which could sever their connection to Western trade, is mounting pressure on China's banks. The optimistic perspective suggests that Russia and Ukraine are strategically positioning themselves to improve their bargaining power ahead of peace negotiations, and they will persist in demanding enhanced military capabilities to counter each other as they continue to advance deeper into the Donbass and Ukraine-occupied Kursk. The pessimistic view holds that neither Russia nor Ukraine are prepared for peace, and they are attempting to persuade the international community of the legitimacy of their cause and their adversaries' unreasonable expectations. The rollout of the Ukraine plan before the General Assembly next week and its reaction will give the world a better view of how difficult it will be to get the two sides talking and willing to end the war that has generated an average of 1,100 casualties a day.